Welcome to Giving Voice to Vision. Our guest today is Brenda Smith, who is the president and CEO of the BWF Project, Incorporated, a nonprofit corporation organized to archive and relevantly communicate the wisdom and life work of Fred Smith Sr. The Breakfast with Fred Leadership Institute strives to stretch and bless the next generation of leaders to the glory of God. Over 5,000 subscribers receive the weekly Thought, a wisdom email which features excerpts from Fred Smith Sr.'s writings. Since 2008, over 20 campus events have occurred, reaching nearly 25,000 students. The Breakfast with Fred Leadership Institute began in 2007 and has participated with 12 Christian colleges and universities in over 20 campus events touching the excess of 17,000 students, faculty, and administrators. Her board service includes Guidepost National Advisory Cabinet, Head Start of Archuleta County, and the Dallas Area Parkinsonism Society. For 7 years, she was the primary caregiver for her parents, Mary Alice and Fred Smith Sr. During this time, she wrote and published Divine Confinement, Facing Seasons of Limitation. Her articles have appeared in Christian and industry periodicals. She is the mother of 3 married children, 9 grandchildren, and 2 great-grands. East Texas is her home. Let's welcome Brenda Smith. Well, welcome, Brenda Smith. We're glad to have you with us today. Tell us, first as we get started, tell us about your interest in ideas.
From the time I was little bitty, I didn't know we called them ideas, but I just know I love to think. And I was kind of an odd kid. I would like to play the piano and read and sit and think. Of course, as I got to know Dad more, then I knew exactly why I was like that. It was in the DNA. You were talking about visioning, and you've given me an opportunity to think a lot about that. And I so appreciate that, Bob and Michelle. And I just came up with my definition of visions. I put that visions begin as an idea triggered by an educational, business, community, or faith opportunity. The idea sparks energy, sparks a sense of purpose and excitement, which then motivates action. But it all starts in the mind, in the heart, given by God. And I truly believe in Ephesians 2:10 that before the foundation of the world, He designed work for us to do. And for me, that work came in the form of ideas. And there you go.
Well,
That's awesome.
Tell us a little bit about, tell us about Breakfast with Fred and how that got started.
I will eagerly tell you about Breakfast with Fred. Let me tell you about the name, because people always ask about the name, and a lot of times I forget. It's second nature to me. But Dad and Mom came to live with me in 2000, and they both lived with me until their last day. During that time, a number of the men that Dad had mentored would, they'd call, they'd come by, they wanted to hear more from Dad. So I decided we should put together a little book. And I made a list, and I started calling these men all over the country. And I said, what do you want to hear from Dad? He's in his last months or years, and he would like to say something that would be helpful. And man by man by man, they'd say, well, when I had breakfast with Fred, he said, because his ideal way to meet with people, especially for the first time, was to say, meet me at 6:00 at Cindy's, which is a Jewish delicatessen in Dallas. It was the very first test anybody ever got with Fred. because sometimes they'd say, "Could we make it 8?" And his answer was, "Sorry, it's 6 or nothing." And he would give anybody one meeting, but he didn't feel any obligation after that if there wasn't something helpful or meaningful going on. But it became Breakfast with Fred. So as we put together the book, that was Breakfast with Fred, we had been uh, gathering ideas along the way, how to keep Dad involved, even though he was bedbound. And doing the website was a key element in that. The Breakfast with Fred Institute, Leadership Institute, began after his death, actually. I was going through files and files. You all have been to my house. You have seen my garage filled with file cabinets full of Fred material. And I started reading through some of those files, and I found one that was called Focus Week. In the 1950s and 1960s, the Southern Baptist Convention, the student department, had an idea. It was their vision to bring business leaders to the college campuses. Dad was on that team. They had never taken, this was long before the laity movement. So they had never had non-ministerial people come and speak to students. So these teams would come and stay 5 days. They stayed in the dorms, they stayed in the fraternity houses, they were in the classes. They built into these students' lives. This file was full of letters from students telling them how their lives had changed because of Focus Week. And literally, I still can see where I was sitting on my couch, and I said, that idea still has legs. I knew that we couldn't go for 5 days, but I knew we could put together that same sense of taking business leaders, ministry leaders, and going into the college environment, into their venues, and really sharing what Jesus Christ means. And then sharing how that they can live their lives through mentoring, through networking, through character building, all the planks of Dad's platform. And I took it to Dr. Robert Sloan, who was president of Houston Baptist University, and he had been a student at Baylor when Dad and those teams came. So he fondly remembered that. He gave us a green light. It was the very first one in 2008. And he wanted his students to experience what he had experienced as a student. So we took teams to Houston and began what we did this for 13 years until COVID shut us down. But it was really about stretching and blessing the next generation to the glory of God.
That's great. And that he did. For some of the people who might be listening and watching, can you tell us a little bit about your dad as far as just kind of a little bit about who he was, what he did, and maybe some people that he mentored?
People, as he grew older, they called him mentor to a generation of leaders. And he was not a professional coach. He didn't consider himself, he didn't hang out a shingle and offer to mentor. Mentoring was a very personal endeavor with him. He was very clear on what mentoring meant. He never approached somebody and offered to be a mentor. He looked for people who came to him and said, I want to develop this skill or this skill. would you spend time with me? Because I see you do this well. And he would spend sometimes years, sometimes people like Bill Glass that he met at Baylor when Bill was a sophomore. Bill was in the hospital when Dad died and still had his pad and pencil. I never knew Bill all those years who didn't come with a pad and a pencil. Zig Ziglar, the same way. You never saw Dad and Zig sit down. That Zig didn't have a pad and a pen taking wild notes from the things that Dad said. But he was a business executive. He was a business owner. He was known as a keynote speaker, as a marketing and sales consultant to companies like Mobil Oil, to Genesco, to Caterpillar. Companies like that would hire him to sit down with their boards, with their management, and really read the temperature of their corporations.
Brenda, was this something that he was born with? Was this something that came from his childhood and his parents and the way they raised him and the values that they gave him?
You know how people in interviews always say, "That's a great question, Michelle." but I'm going to say that to you because Dad grew up the son of a Southern Baptist preacher who moved from little bitty church to little bitty church. They lived in the middle of the Depression. His mom and dad had 6 children. Their daughter died. There were 5 boys. They lived in the Mill District of Nashville, Tennessee, very, very poor. My grandfather never saw a soul he wouldn't help. During the Depression, they were barely making it. But when that knock came on the door, my granddaddy, said, "Mrs. Smith, put another bowl of soup on the table." And he grew up in a godly home, but not a home that had any influence of business or it wasn't part of their family culture. When he was a young man, he met a man named Maxie Jarman, who was then the president of General Shoe Corporation, one of the biggest employers in Nashville. And Maxie, I've never called him Maxie, Mr. Jarman, taught a Sunday school class at First Baptist Church in Nashville. Dad said, "I want to be where that man is. I want to learn from that man." So he joined that Sunday school class, eventually became president of the Sunday school class. Mr. Jarman mentored Dad. And I still remember the day Mr. Jarman died. I rarely saw my dad cry, but I saw him as he said goodbye to Mr. Jarman. He believed in gifts, spiritual and also just human gifts given by God, and believed in what he called your uniqueness. And he encouraged everyone to find their uniqueness and operate from that. And when he was 28, Dad sat on a tombstone in a cemetery in Nashville, Tennessee, and looked around and thought and decided what he wanted on his tombstone. And it was, he stretched others. And that is how he really spent his life. An evangelist came to their little church to preach and met Dad as a teenager and really saw something in him and said, "Fred, I want to give you a life verse." Now, this is paraphrased, but it was Dad's. It was out of Proverbs. It was, "Take the gift that God has given you and use it, and you will stand before great men."
Wow.
Whoa.
And Dad had no background. He did not go to college. There was no money for college. Dad used to laugh. He said, you know, the only time that I went on college campuses is when I went to address or receive an honorary doctorate.
Wow. Wow.
But he was known for his wisdom. He was known for his faith. He was on many, many Christian boards, the chair of a number of them. He had an uncanny ability to look at a situation, distill it down to what we call Fred says, kind of one-liners. And he was a remarkable man. And he and I were best buddies from the time I can remember ever being around him. He and I were really close.
Would you say kindred spirits, Brenda?
Yes.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I would. Now, we used to disagree on things, but we had great respect. And when Dad was bedbound, we would do what we call weekly thoughts. And I would sit with my laptop next to his bed, and I'd say, "Okay, Dad, you know, give me 300 words," and he could do it. He would have an idea, and he would talk about it, and I would just type away. And one day, one of his friends came and was sitting while we were going through that. It was a day where Dad was going down rabbit trails, which you know him, you remember his rabbit trails. Some of his speaking was great because he would key off the audience. When you put it in writing, it gets a little fuzzy because you go down these trails. But he was doing that. And I'd say, "No, Dad, no, get back on target, get back on the trail, the main trail." And this man sat there, and this was one of Dallas's top businessmen. And he just sat there and watched. And when we were through, he said, "I've never seen anybody talk to Fred Smith like that." But we had great respect and love for one another.
What a gift.
In launching Breakfast with Fred, what obstacles did you face along the way, and where has your journey taken you through the time as well?
That's a question that I had to stop because it seemed like the process was so seamless. I had people ask me all the time, "Well, how do you do your marketing? How do you get in front of these college presidents?" And honestly, it was a networking endeavor or enterprise. We started strong, and we never ever did cold calls, and so that made it seem easier. Now, the backroom work was not so easy. I believe as I looked at that question, the greatest obstacle was me, because I'm a visionary, because I have that entrepreneurial spirit. I had territorial sense about my idea. I was used to having an idea, selling it to whoever can help me get it done, resourcing it, and then doing it. I did not know what the academic world was like. I will tell you, frankly, the very first school, I called them and I said, "I think we need to cancel this. This is just not working," because they had to keep meeting and meeting and meeting before we could even take a step forward. And they said, no, we can do this." It really taught me a lot. And I'm most grateful for that obstacle, because every school became easier, all because Joy Lynn Reed had taught me how to face those obstacles.
Wow.
Wow.
And thank you for sharing that and for your vulnerability about that.
Well, hopefully none of those people will recognize their story.
Would you share a story of the impact of your journey and how it helped others or a particular person? A story that you recall?
Michelle, not very long ago, I decided to sit down with my list of Facebook friends and just see what Ron Glosser, remember our friend Ron Glosser? He wrote a book called The Genealogy of Friendship. Well, I was taking his idea and doing a genealogy of Facebook to see where the people came from, see who the centers of influence were. And as I look back over and over and over, it's BWF, BWFLI, and the people I would never have known had we not been on these campuses. And at Houston Baptist, the very first event we did, we were packing up to go back, and this young Asian girl came over to me, and she was so quiet. And she said, "Miss Smith, if I had never been here today, I would have forever regretted it." And I will never forget her. And so we started a tradition with our schools. When we finished our last event, we would line up, the team would line up, and every student who was in that session would come by, and we would say a word of blessing on each student as they passed.
Wow.
And you can tell from my tears, that blessed me, and I will never forget those times. And I still, every week, I'm in contact with some of those students.
Oh, wow.
Some of my best friends, my traveling friends from BWF.
Wow. I would love to know how those words are probably still affecting those now not students, or perhaps some of them are, what that did to their life. I would love to know. That's amazing.
I hope so. Dad said something that I incorporated into into our events. He would often ask a younger audience, or even older ones, who was the first one to say, "I believe in you"? And it is a profound question. It sounds like a throwaway, but it's a profound question. School after school, at some point, I would always stop and I would say, who was the first one to ever say, "I believe in you"? And these were leaders that had been chosen by the school to be part of these sessions. And we never had a school that one of these students didn't come and say, "No one has ever said that to me." And so when we blessed them, a good part of that was looking them in the eye and just saying, "I believe in you."
It sounds so simple, but it is, like you said, so profound.
It is. Just try it sometime. You will be surprised at the people who are accomplished, who are successful, and you ask them that question. A lot of times it's a mom or grandmother, but there are those who have achieved greatly, and in spite of not hearing those words. While we still have this time, May I say a word about the personality style of a visionary? Because this means a lot to me. Now, you have to remember, I was a certified Myers-Briggs person. So, I've spent a lot of my life looking at preferences and grids. But I wanted to let you know about an experience I had in my life. I was with a group who were clients of a local high level life coach. He brought in his clients and then he brought in an expert to speak to each of the personality styles that he had identified. I sat there and he got to my style and he gave the characteristics, and I'm nodding. I'm a good audience. I was raised by a speaker and I am a good audience. So I'm nodding and agreeing and talking about how my style are we have lots of ideas and start lots of projects, and boy, I was right with him. Then he said, here are some downsides. You start a lot and you don't finish a lot. My heart, it was like he had pierced my heart because that was the truth. Then he went on to talk, and he went on, and I was wanting to tell him, hey, you don't have to press the point. It's okay. I've got it. Because every time he told a story, I'm going, wait, hold on. But he told the story of John Lennon, and he had decided that John Lennon's personality style was the same as my group. When he and Yoko Ono separated, he had 18 months in which he didn't write, he didn't accomplish anything. He was just barren. Then he and Yoko reconciled. And from that day until he was murdered was the most prolific time in his life. That hit me so hard because I knew I had to have people in my life when I started a project who would be the ones to execute the ideas that rumbled around in my head. I'd been told early on in my career, if you have an assistant, if you have a team, you can do anything. If you don't, you will never accomplish what you want. So it all fell together. I drove home from that meeting and I cried. I cried because that was so truthful. I immediately went home, took a Post-it note, and wrote, Dear Lord, I will work, I will prepare. Please bring me a Yoko. From that point on, anytime I started a project, I would pray, asking for the Yoko. So whether it was my writing Divine Confinement, whether it was the Breakfast with Fred book, whether it was the website, whether it was the BWFLI, whatever the project was, I asked for the humility and the discernment to see when God had brought Yoko. So when visionaries get their 2 o'clock word from God, it is incumbent upon them to understand their strengths, but also to understand that God has put us together to accomplish His goals and achieve His ends. So visionaries need to learn the lesson of Yoko. It changed my life.
Brenda, we've talked about a lot of great things today, and one of the things that I know is dear to your heart are strengths. Can you talk to us about strengths and how that plays a part for visionaries and those that they work with?
Absolutely. Our friend Kat Van Dusen is such a great source in the area of strengths. There was a period of time when I was in corporate leadership, and part of that was going to hear every consultant who had hit the road with their shtick, and a lot of it was overcoming weaknesses, And I would stop back in Dallas and I would talk to Dad and say, hogwash. And I said, oh, but Dad, so and so and so and so and so and so, they're big names, and this is their plan for overcoming weaknesses. He said, no, focus on your strengths and buttress your weaknesses. Don't spend time trying to overcome a weakness. That's a waste of time and energy, and it's a waste of your gift.
Wow.
So I believe that visionaries are really, it's imperative that a visionary clearly discern what their uniqueness, what their gifts are, and work to develop those and bring people around them who have the other gifts, the other strengths, because God put us together that way. That's how he designed his org chart. It looks like that.
Changing the subject a little bit because we want people to know how they can find you. Tell us a little bit about the website.
All right, there are two websites. Sorry about my shirt. There's breakfastwithfred.com. That was the original website. It's an archive. It has some small, every day, there's a rotating few hundred words, something about 120 words from Dad's wisdom. That was how we started. That's the original piece. On that website, you can sign up for weekly thought, and please do. It's every Tuesday morning at 6:05, about 300 or 400 words of Dad's wisdom, not on every subject, on leadership, on faith, on family, on motivation. I put those together and I go through. I have thousands of pages of things that he jotted down or that his secretary had typed, and we just put that together. That's the weekly thought on breakfastwithfred.com. one of the areas I would highly recommend called Fred Said's.
Mm.
I think there's several hundred of his one-liners, and they're just excellent. He wrote me a note one day because, as you know me, I like to be involved. I really like being active. And one day I got an envelope and had this little piece of paper, and scribbled on it said, Brenda, opportunity is not mandate. And I called him and he said, Brenda, just because a door opens doesn't mean you need to walk through it.
Ah.
And that has been so good. So that's one of the lines. Opportunity is not mandate.
That is so good. So good. Because we think, oh, I have this idea or this happened. It must be, I must see it all the way through.
Absolutely. It's like eating all the food on your plate. Sometimes you don't need to.
No, exactly.
Oswald Chambers says, look for the closed door. Ask God to show you the closed doors, not the open doors. And that has helped me tremendously, because women particularly are very susceptible to Christian women, to looking at these open doors and thinking we have to go through. My friend Bill Hendricks, Howard Hendricks' son, has written several books. He is an extraordinary gifted man. His business or his ministry is called the Giftedness Center, and he focuses on that. And one of the lines in his book, which has just helped me tremendously, he says, focus on the call to, not the can do. And I think that hits women even more than men.
Yes.
Because, sorry, Bob, but we really can do a lot.
I know you guys can do many things at once where men can only do one thing at a time.
No, that's exactly right. And so I can't tell you how many young women, and you know, when we sit down and I say, as Bill Hendricks says, focus on the call to, not the can do.
That's really rich.
That's good.
It is.
One of the other things I love is that his teachings and his wisdom is absolutely timeless.
Yes.
Nothing you've said today that I would say, oh, that's old school.
I know.
Still cutting edge. It's still cutting edge.
It is, because he was principle based. He used to tell me, Brenda, the principles never change, only the illustrations.
Oh, that's so good.
So it's like having that basic black dress, and the only thing that changes are the scarves and the jewelry.
Sure. Wow.
Well, we're going to wrap up, but I've got one last question for you.
Okay.
The
question away.
The question is more of a request.
Okay.
We have people listening that may have a vision, may not have a vision, that are in leadership. But if you were given 1 or 2 minutes to share your heart for your life message, or your message of what you've done with your ministry, what nugget would you give us that you would want to leave us with?
Trust God. And one time we were sitting with 2 women students, Charlotte McNally and I were sitting. And I asked the students, what keeps you up at night? And their answer, campus after campus, was always, what's next? And then Charlotte said to the young ladies, what would you say to a young person coming on? And then they said, Mrs. McNally, what would you say? And she said, I would see the goodness of God. And I guess over these years, he's got a plan. I never doubt that. He has got a glorious, grand, loving plan for you. Trust him. Trust him.
Mm.
Mm.
Yeah, that's very significant, Brenda. Very significant. Wow, what a wonderful time to spend. Thank you so much for coming on. We hope and pray that many people get to hear your words and your wisdom, and of course, the words of your dad that live on through many people, probably more
Yes.
than we'll ever know. But I'm sure he's had many people already come to him in heaven and say, Fred, I'm here because of you.
Well, thank you so much, Brenda, for your time today and your wisdom,
Thank you.
and your
I
words.
love you all.
And we love you, Brenda.